Caleb, it's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
And I look forward to this conversation. I will tell you that most individual congregational histories are interesting but not well done. You were in a unique position, and obviously you put a great deal of work into producing a congregational history that is both interesting and well done. So I congratulate you on it. Whose idea was this?
It grew out of a Sunday school class. So we teach a church history course seminar, and I was on the teaching team for that. And the last class in that series was the history of Capital Baptist Church, and we had about 3 paragraphs that Bruce Kiesling had written back in 1997. Yep. And I thought, I think we could do a little bit better than 3 paragraphs. And so I went down to our archives and looked at the minutes and drew out some fresh material, and the elders were so encouraged by the stories I drew out that they thought, well, somebody should write a book about this. You wouldn't possibly be interested in writing a book about this, and that had been a dream of mine for quite some time. So in some ways it was my idea, in some ways it was the elders' idea, but they had the vision for it, and I did the execution.
Well, and you did it well. I want to tell you, I found it not only interesting because I knew it was going to be interesting, but I found it in 2 other dimensions of significance. One of it is I think it's important. This is one of those congregational stories that really needs to be told simply because of what Capitol Hill Baptist Church was and is as a gospel congregation there. I think the other thing about it is that when you think you know the story, you really don't know the story. And so I've been so connected to Capitol Hill, even before Mark became pastor, Mark Dever became pastor. And yet I found I was surprised in almost every page.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Were you?
Yes. Well, that's the thing. There are some books that historians write where you know the broad contours of the story.
Right.
You know the main characters, the main protagonists. You know the basic arc of the story. This was one of those where we knew a few different things, but there was a whole lot to fill in, and there was a whole lot we didn't know that was just discovered in the process.
Now, at least a part of this, because I want to get to kind of the big picture of things, but at least a part of this is really interesting, is that somehow a lot of historical materials had been preserved, and in one sense, that's almost miraculous.
Yeah, so I visited dozens of churches in the course of writing this book, looking at their minutes, looking for supplementary information. And it is interesting, when you visit churches, they often have some documentation, but not as much as what we had. We had basically a whole room full of filing cabinets, which was just overwhelming at first. And I digitized 12 boxes worth of materials, which was about 50,000 pages. And that was just about a third of the materials that was there. So it was a lot of material to wade through. But what that means is you have a lot of source material to draw from, to shape the narrative, and to get the details that help the story come to life.
Yeah, having enough was clearly not the problem. Knowing what to deal with was the issue. So I'm going to give you a challenge. I want you to give us the 1-minute history of Capitol Hill Baptist Church.
Yeah, founded in 1878, grew out of a prayer meeting that a widow called together in 1867 on Capitol Hill. The church grew in the first few decades despite a difficult split, but through faithful preaching of the gospel. The church grew exponentially in the 20th century through a long pastorate of 41 years under which the present building was built. But after that pastor retired, it led to succession challenges in the life of the church, which shifted the church in a decidedly more conservative and more Southern Baptist direction in the mid-20th century. In the second half of the 20th century, through suburbanization, racial conflict in the city, the church hollowed out until it was almost depleted by the time Mark Dever got there in 1994. And the church has grown since then through the faithful preaching of the gospel and the Holy Spirit working on the hearts and lives of people at the church.
Yeah, when I think about the historical context, Washington, D.C., and I mean, you're so close to the Capitol, you look out and see the dome. You're
5 blocks, 6 blocks.
Right behind the Supreme Court, adjacent to the Library of Congress. There's a sense in which you think, how is it that there wasn't a church here earlier in the 19th century? But, Washington's a strange town.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, so Washington's oldest church is actually in the south east part of Capitol Hill, and that's an Episcopalian church. But yeah, there was really nothing much going on Capitol Hill until after the Civil War, when the city's growing, and then especially D.C. has always grown through war.
Right.
The federal government has always grown through war, and so the city has always grown.
And big government spending now.
That's right.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm serious.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons why the city of Washington, D.C. is basically recession-proof.
Yeah.
The rest of the country goes through a recession. Washington never knows a recession. But that neighborhood in which Capitol Hill is Baptist Church is located, it's gone through enormous transition. There was a time when it was one of the most prestigious addresses in Washington.
Yeah.
Then there was a long time when you started having, general stores go in where you had once had, executive mansions, and then now it's pretty tightly populated again, and it's again a very no one would doubt the importance of that neighborhood.
Yeah, and as I looked at our church's history and tried to understand what makes it distinct, as I've studied Baptist and just religious life in the nation's capital, as far as I can tell, there is no other church from the 19th century that has stayed centered on the gospel and has stayed in the neighborhood it was founded in.
Yeah.
Every other church has either moved on from the gospel, such that they're no longer preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ today, or they moved to the suburbs to get out when things were hard and to follow where their members were. And so what makes Capitol Baptist Church unique among churches in Washington, D.C. is they stayed centered on the gospel and they stayed in the neighborhood. And we could have moved and probably kept the gospel. But Washington would have lost a faithful, confessional, evangelical witness on Capitol Hill in a way that you can't just create today.
Yeah.
You can't have that land and that building and that presence unless you stay. And so that's really the story of the church, how they kept the gospel and how they stayed in their neighborhood.
Yeah. And it really is a neighborhood church. You do draw, even now, from Northern Virginia, Maryland and other places. But it's amazing how many people walk to church at CHBC.
Yeah.
And how many people live right there.
Yeah, probably. I mean, we can probably park, 40 cars. But a congregation, 1,000 in attendance each Sunday, half the people are walking.
Yeah. My acquaintance with Capitol Hill Baptist Church came years before Mark Dever went as pastor. It was then Capitol Hill Metropolitan Baptist Church. Why was it that?
Yeah, they changed the name to so the church was founded as Metropolitan Baptist Church in a time when all the denominations were starting metropolitan churches in the city, kind of being like, we're going to be the church for the city.
Like Spurgeon's Metropolitan Tabernacle.
Yeah, we don't know that they were mimicking Spurgeon per se, but they at least adopted that name, Metropolitan Baptist Church. In 1967, they changed the name because there was a historic African-American church of the same name in D.C., also called Metropolitan. So there's some confusion consistently over its history. That also made the record searching process a little difficult when you have two Baptist churches by the same name in the same city. 67, they added Capitol Hill, and then in 1995, they dropped Metropolitan to just be Capitol Hill Baptist Church.
And they dropped Metropolitan for another reason.
It had another meaning in the 90s.
Yeah, just so, I'm not sure everyone knows because this is a long time ago, but the LGBTQ movement started a denomination known as the Metropolitan Community Church. And that led to some confusion there at people
that
coming
was certainly not us.
to Capitol Hill Baptist Church thinking it was something else. When I first came to know the church, it was kind of famously dually aligned. Yeah. And saw itself, I think, arguably as more a part of some kind of evangelicalism than really of any denomination. It was Baptist, but it was in lowered tones. It was like Capitol Hill Baptist Church.
And when would this have been?
In the 80s and 90s.
In the 80s, okay. Yeah.
Before Mark went.
I could see that. Yeah, I could certainly see that.
And a part of it was because my first knowledge of the church is based upon the fact that one of my mentors was a long-term member there, and that's Carl F.H. Henry.
Carl Henry.
And so Carl Henry is a member of that church. And even Henry's conception of it was kind of like an evangelical fortress opportunity there on Capitol Hill. He was a Baptist, but given the circumstances of his life and of evangelicalism at the time, I think he saw it as less Baptist than Mark Dever sees it as Baptist.
Yeah, I know in the 50s and 60s, we advertised ourselves as a Southern Baptist witness on Capitol Hill. But yeah, as you mentioned, the Baptists of Washington were famously dually aligned. The state convention, it's not a state, but the D.C. Baptist Convention was aligned with both Northern and Southern Baptist conventions. And we actually started designating our giving in the 1940s under K.O. and White to no longer give to the Northern Baptist Convention.
And see, this is what's amazing, and I'm sure you know a lot about K.O. and White.
Yes.
K.O. and White left there and went to be pastor of First Baptist Church of Houston, Texas. Let's just say it's a different church. K.O. and White was one of the first persons in the SBC in a major pulpit to sound the alarm about liberalism in the SBC. Preached a famous sermon entitled "Death in the Pot." Taking that biblical reference to say that theological liberalism was in the pot of the SBC and it would eventually kill it. He was elected president of the Southern Baptist Convention, and a lot of people don't know he was ever at CHBC.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. It was one of his early pastorates. He had just finished his PhD here at Southern in Old Testament, and he was called to Capitol Hill Metropolitan Baptist Church, not because of the pulpit committee of the church, but because the congregation voted to call him against the wishes of the pulpit committee. So this was after the 41-year pastorate of John Compton Ball, who built the building, legacy pastor, and the pulpit committee moves to call a Northern Baptist minister, a well-known figure named Ralph Walker. But then at that meeting, a longtime Sunday school teacher, Mrs. Agnes Schenkel, raises her hand and says, "I've heard considerable reports about Ralph Walker that he's compromising in matters related to the fundamentalist modernist controversy." And that's all the congregation needs to hear. So the pulpit committee withdraws their nomination, and the congregation moves to call K.O. and White.
How do they know of him?
He had come and preached for them as a candidate.
Okay.
And exactly what the connection was, there was a Samuel.
He gets his name right, by the way. Says R. Albert Mohler.
Yeah, that's right.
K.O. and White. Excuse me.
Exactly. Very good. I don't exactly know the connection to the church, but in any case, he came and he preached expositionally.
Well, a lot of the connections at that time were explicitly congressional.
That makes sense.
And so there'd be a senator from Texas or a representative from Texas, and he heard this kid preach.
Yes.
And so that's the way a lot of the things there took place. Oh, by the way, a lot of the hiring in Washington, period. But Washington became, it was the capital of the United States of America. And so there were people there in that church who had roots elsewhere. They knew of people elsewhere. That was very powerful. Still is.
Yeah, there was a letter that a congressman from Louisiana, Asa Leonard, wrote back to his constituents just extolling the church. This is back in the 1920s, and he said no modernism will be tolerated at all at this church. But K.O. and White came and he preached expositionally. He introduced membership classes, 5-week membership classes. He revised the church rolls to drop 995 non-attenders, and he saw a revival break out of the church. 848 people baptized in 5 years, and just a remarkable ministry. And I think it was the most decisive pastorate in the church's history up until Mark Dever, because I think that's where the church might have been going slowly in the direction of many of the other churches in the district.
Yes.
But that was he took it in a decisively a more conservative and theological direction.
Yeah.
But you were mentioning Carl Henry.
Right.
Who was your connection to Capitol Metropolitan?
Yes. So that's how I first heard of it. But I also just my interest in Baptist history, my involvement with Baptists in the Capitol, wow. I knew it was there.
Yeah.
And, a little footnote in my personal history, my wife, Mary, her brother, Mark, I married my college roommate sister.
Okay.
He had done an internship. That's a proof you're okay guy. If you're a college roommate, you marry your sister. That's a pretty good sign. But he was doing a journalism degree through Northwestern University, graduate degree. And he had a time to spend in Washington, and Capitol Hill Baptist Church had a hostel for students.
Yes, they did.
Which is now Mark Dever's house.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so what is now Mark Dever's study was my brother-in-law's room.
That's incredible.
During that time. So I came to know the church that way.
And that same house was built by the church's first treasurer. So our trustees, the earliest document we have is a trustees meeting from 1874 in that house.
Wow.
Which is just remarkable.
Yeah. Well, and it's just remarkable that I'll tell you, one of the greatest signs of God's providence to me about Capitol Hill Baptist Church is the fact that it survived and wasn't chopped up and sold.
Yeah.
And so I know you know this, but one of the interesting things that Carl Henry brought to my attention was that he had this dream that would become a great Baptist center on Capitol Hill. His plan was to destroy the building and to build, you've probably seen the pictures.
I've seen pictures.
Yeah, to build this kind of modern Baptist conference center where there would still be a church and still have a congregation, but it would kind of become a
large parking garage.
Right. Which, by the way, is just kind of not only a symptom of evangelicalism at the time, it's kind of a symptom of Washington, D.C. at the time. Because the address, the location of Capitol Baptist Church, so close to the Capitol, so much at the heart of the action. The idea was, this could be useful 7 days a week. I think your point, Mark Dever's point, would certainly be, it is.
Amen.
When you got into this, you've got all kinds of things going on. You have 2 world wars. You have a Great Depression. And so some of this is commonalities with other congregations. And unfortunately, one of those commonalities is a scandal in the pulpit.
Oh, yeah.
And that's during my time of knowing the church.
Really?
And even in ripple effects and after effects, where frankly, I never would have made the connection of my dear friend Mark Dever to that church. This is before Mark. Tell us how you handled that as a church historian.
Yeah. So Mark's predecessor, Harry Kilbride, disqualified himself morally in a very heinous way, and that was well known. I knew that part of the story. I knew that I would have to explore that, and so as soon as I started the project, I found myself in England, and he had retired to England, and I reached out to him. He was still living at the time to see if I could interview him, and he responded kindly, but declined an interview and declined a subsequent phone call, which I could understand. But I wanted to at least give him the chance to hear from him. I knew it would require great sensitivity. I also knew that I needed to go into it with a certain amount of objectivity and not just take word for it. So there were a lot of stories circulating of things that were said.
And that's the nature of that kind of event. Yeah. You've got to separate truth from reality, and the truth is sometimes distorted both ways.
So I tried to rely on documents primarily, and thankfully there was a large repository of documents that I was able to rely on, including some documents that were agreed on by both parties. But it was extensive interviews with all parties involved, and really I haven't really spoken much about this publicly, but I tried as best as I could to get to know the pastor, to understand him. I interviewed people at each of the previous churches that he had pastored, because there were also allegations that this had happened before.
Which, if I might interject, is almost always how it happens. It almost always happens that when something like this breaks out in a sudden flash of controversy, you find out there were roots to this.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's one of those things where the reality sadly appears in my mind much worse than what is described in the book. And yet, I think there's a certain amount of intellectual honesty in telling the truth of what happened.
Was there pressure not to?
No. But there's an understandable sensitivity, and he passed away a few years ago, and I think there were questions of well, do you really want to, continue to repeat this and cause further, damage on people involved? And ultimately we decided, yes, we need to tell the truth, but we're not looking to tell a salacious story. This isn't we're going to try to be clear on the details and clear on the specifics, but not go into unnecessary details on it. But it is a warning. It is a warning tale, because he was a man who knew all the theology. He had excellent instincts theologically, and yet his own life was not in step with what he taught, and the church suffered terribly as a result. and his own family has suffered as a result. And so there's a warning tale to learn from it, and it also helps when you read the book. It also helps you understand the church that Mark Dever inherited and the precarious state that the church found themselves in.
Yeah, so I knew the church through those connections and through those events, but mostly I knew it through Carl Henry.
Yeah,
and Carl Henry is really how Mark Dever became introduced to the church.
that's right.
And I was not particularly pleased with that.
I can understand.
Because I was hiring Mark Dever for the faculty at Southern Seminary.
And a lot of people thought that's what he should have done. A lot of people in his life were telling him, "You're not built for the pastorate. You're not built for preaching. You're built."
In some
for
ways,
teaching."
he's profoundly not.
And he would say that. He would say as much.
And I don't mean in terms of biblical qualifications,
No.
for which he is exceedingly,
Yeah.
exceedingly
But
well
temperamentally,
equipped.
perhaps.
Yeah,
or-
and so I would
academically.
say this. And what I'm saying of him, I'm saying of myself. I think there's a sense in which I want to tell you I couldn't be president of most schools because I wouldn't believe in them enough. This takes total belief in the rightness of doing this. The skill set could be applied elsewhere. My heart wouldn't be there. And so I'm trying to hire Mark.
Yeah.
And I thought it was done. and he's my best friend in the world. And we had, I think you know this, that under my desk, there is an entire cabinet of letters between that I wrote to Mark. Well, actually, he has those, but that Mark wrote to me over years because there was no internet, there's no email. So multiple times a week, we're pouring out our heart to one another at a crucial stage in our life about what we're learning theologically, what we're thinking about, what the Lord's showing us, and what we're doing. We're newly married, all these things, and those letters are. They're right under research table in my office, in my home study. I can pull them out from time to time. And I want to say to young pastors, young men in particular, you need somebody with whom you're such a close friend that you've got bundled letters where you poured out your heart to one another. And on theological issues and exegetical issues, everything's new. We're just trying to learn all this together. Mark's at Cambridge during that time. I'm here. I thought that was going to happen. I will tell you that I sensed how right it was that Mark would be at Capitol Hill. And in retrospect, in the same way I think someone can say, well, here's the ordering of your life, I can see how you end up in 1993 as the president of Southern Seminary. It's a work of God. But at least you can say, okay, at least in retrospect, I can pull this together. It's exactly the same I would say of Mark at Capitol Hill Baptist Church.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Even as he was, I think he was probably as surprised as you were. But, the way he described it, Carl Henry reached out to him and asked, would you come and preach? Is there any chance you'd consider this now vacant pulpit? And Mark came and he preached for the church in the summer of 93. And the next morning in his quiet time had an overwhelming sense that this was what the Lord wanted him to do.
So I got to be careful how I say this because it could sound weird. But I think if you take the stewardship of something like this institution, you just begin to feel all of its creaks and groans and joys very personally. You begin to feel it. I could sense early on in Mark's ministry that the same thing was true of Mark Dever's heart and mind in the ministry of Capitol Hill Baptist Church. At some point you say, I can't separate it. I know the Lord will separate us one point. But at this point, I can't separate Mark Dever from Capitol Hill Baptist Church because so much of it's now in Mark's heart that the architecture of the church is in a lot of ways the architecture of his heart. Does that make sense to you?
It does. I mean, the Lord. I think the Lord so knits the hearts of pastor and people together, that in a well-ordered church they do become
Yeah.
one. I mean, you have Paul saying,
There's more.
You
there
are
are
a letter
many
of
more
recommendation.
people, but at least with the pastor
Yeah.
who takes that responsibility, it's a wonderful thing. It's I don't want to make this mystical, although it is, I guess. But it's kind of like a marriage of ways, in which it just over time you just see, well, this was right. This is so right. God put this together, and I took office here, and it was just a few months later that Mark went to CHBC. And so really the most of our adult lives, we were either students together or in the same two places of ministry together. Yeah. And so when we speak to one another, we've got decades of knowing basically everything. Mm-hmm. And I look at Capitol Hill Baptist Church and I look at Mark and I go, in God's providence, this was the right man at the right time with the right heart and the right vision, even the right personality. Mm-hmm. And that's not a small thing to fit someone in like a puzzle piece in a church set in the puzzle piece of Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
And how the Lord's blessed is just remarkable.
Yeah, amen. And I think among other ways, there's the preaching, but I think Mark's ability to disciple men and to raise up pastors for ministry has been a distinctive feature of his life and ministry. And Washington has been a wonderfully well-suited city for that location. I mean, I'm an example of this, but so many young men have come to Washington, D.C. with ambitions for themselves and for politics and become captivated with a vision for the local church and serving the Lord Jesus Christ in ministry. Not that it's not a valid calling to serve the Lord in the political realm or the business realm, but there's been something about the proclamation of the gospel in the context of the local church that has just been compelling. And Mark's been a wonderful model of the goodness of giving your life toward ministry in the local church.
Right. There's another thing here. I've never talked about this publicly, but I come from the high church Baptist tradition. Yeah. Very much a high church Southern Baptist convention. Mark came from not that, but he understood it. Then he went to Cambridge. Mm-hmm. And he came back from Cambridge a very low church Baptist. Now, I mean that in worship style and things. In terms of ecclesiology, very, very high church in terms of high ecclesiology. But, if you look at Mark Dever and you look at Washington, D.C. and Capitol Hill, there's a part of you that, given Mark's mode, you'd say, I'm not sure that looks exactly like Capitol Hill. I think even Carl Henry got something other than what he expected. But Mark's authenticity on Capitol Hill, his approachability, his geniality, the words just use those. And I'll talk about the internship and his production and more in a minute. But, if you say big institutional church pastor on Capitol Hill, you have a picture that Mark Dever really doesn't intend to fulfill. Is that fair?
I think I know what you mean. Yeah.
Well, let's put it this way. He dresses the music style.
Yeah.
The incredible gospel joy that is in all of that. And so to look at the worship of Capitol Baptist Church, it's extremely Protestant traditional.
It is.
But it's also somewhat Puritan.
Yeah.
It's a blend that is Mark in so many ways. And so it's historic Protestant, it's historic Baptist, but it's also just, in other words, when you think of Washington as the power center, you think how people dress in the Capitol, you think about how they carry themselves, Mark is, in that sense, delightfully sectarian.
Yeah, and there's a certain amount of taking God seriously, but not taking yourself seriously. The anecdote. Maybe you've heard Mark say this. When he was he did like some student government thing in D.C. as a teenager, and he was president of Congress for the day as a 15-year-old, and he stood outside of Congress shaking everyone's hand afterwards, the student body, and he had some green slime in his hand, so that every time someone shook hands with him, they felt this green slime on their hand, and it was just his own little way of all these people taking themselves so seriously, just playing a little joke on him. And there's a little clue there into Mark Dever's personality. And so, whether it's meeting a senator or a cabinet member, he's not looking to kind of make a big deal of what other people are going to make a big deal of. He's looking to make a big deal of the Lord Jesus Christ, and not fearing man, but also just being fairly approachable. And
he's very approachable.
Yeah,
I think he's incredibly approachable. I think he's one of the most natural people persons I've ever known in my life. I mean, to find Mark Dever walking anywhere, there's going to be a swarm around him. Fair to say?
That's fair to say. It's fair to say.
Yeah, and
I heard that in Cambridge, he had this big bay window overlooking the street, and he would sit in that window and kind of have it open so that whenever he saw somebody he knew, he could kind of just step out and wave at them.
Yeah, he wears himself very lightly, and he has the ability to kind of disregard things that I don't think I have, and so, I mean, sometimes I will tell him something and he'll go, meh. And you know what I mean? That's actually what he does.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, but that's a part of the friendship. Is that it's kind of like a situation in which I know of a wonderful set of friends, men who are friends and been friends for decades, and one friend was asked and in very high leadership positions. And one friend was asked, what is the most remarkable thing about your friendship during all those years? And he said, the Lord has managed to see to it that we never have both panicked at the same moment. And, there's a part of that. You kind of go, okay, let me do a reality check. Let's see where this is. And I can remember how low the numbers were when Mark went.
Yeah,
I was one of the speakers at his installation, and it was a sweet, sweet event.
Yeah.
And kind of the last gathering of some people, with Carl Henry and Roger Nicole, and
Timothy George was there.
Timothy George, other people you say, well, I can't imagine. Of course,
Fred Catherwood.
That's right, Sir Fred.
Yeah.
Yeah. There aren't that many Sir Freds in Baptist life. And British knew him from, and that's the son-in-law of Martin Lloyd-Jones, just to make that connection. When Mark went, he brought this. So at least my thinking about Mark Dever, and so this is just one perspective. I don't know how he'd respond to this himself, but when he went to England, he came back partly anglicized.
Yeah.
And I don't mean Anglican in the church. I mean Anglican in terms of British nonconformity, British Baptist life. And so, he brought a bit of that. I think in God's providence, it was a way of like dropping pretentiousness in being on Capitol Hill.
Yeah.
And just long-term faithfulness. But he is magnetic. He's magnetic in a way few people are. He comes most alive with the opportunity to influence, converse, connect. He's the biggest connector of human beings I know in my life. He's the most natural connector I've ever known in my life. So from the time I've known him, he has just made a connection. And so, and this is the way he does it. He'll do this. And so, like if you're together and you're in some meeting, Mark Dever will come over, grab one of you physically, grab the other one physically, put you before each other and say, Al, the other person's name, talk. And then he just turns away and walks away. And it's just, so actually it was Mark who introduced me to Lig Duncan.
Oh, yeah.
When Lig was studying in Edinburgh and Mark was studying in Cambridge and I'm doing the PhD here. And so Ligon and I have this friendship that develops before I could ever meet him. We're corresponding against letters and things. And you say, okay, well, the glue here is that Mark picked up someone else. And by the way, that's how Mark became my friend, is because someone else was talking to Mark Dever here on this campus right after he'd arrived. And he said, Al Mohler? And he said, no. And he said, well, you got a common ancestry, And so he walked him to my office.
Yep.
And just said more or less, talk. And that's how it all started. I think Mark was in my office 2 hours.
And he had Annie with him in the stroller
He
the whole
did.
time.
You remember? Yeah.
That's what I've heard.
He had just, she was a baby.
2-year-old.
She was not particularly interested in the meeting. She was a baby. It was just so sweet.
But this is one argument in favor of in-person seminary and the mission that Southern Seminary is engaged in is you don't get those friendships without a shared context where these brothers with shared theological instincts are coming together for a time to engage in the process of theological formation.
No, that's right. In fact, I've got several favorite photographs, and one of them is of Mark holding Katie when she was like 6 weeks old, and now Katie's right there on what we call the compound, so integrally involved, and our grandchildren. All they know is Pastor Moak, who to them is such, I get emotional here, such a wholesome, wonderful thing just to see this. And then in all God's providence, this is just totally strange. I've never had this happen in an interview before. But your little boy picked out a dress for my granddaughter. Mm-hmm. How sweet is that? How old?
Theodore's 4. He'll be 5 this summer, and he is determined. He is determined to marry little Mary Margaret. In fact,
well, it got a good start. I'll say she loves him. Yeah.
Little Hannah Gardner officiated the ceremony not more than a week ago.
Oh, that's really
they
sweet.
They're a little plan for 10 on the playground. But that's one of the joys is in pastoral ministry there on Capitol Hill with the housing provided. Those of us on pastoral staff, we're all neighbors with each other, and one of the gifts that means is our children are friends with each other. So my children are friends with the grandchildren of Dr. and Mrs. Mohler. And there's real joy in the camaraderie of serving together, but also seeing children form wholesome and joyful friendships with each other.
Yeah, I just want to tell you, brothers, the Lord gives you more than you know to ask or think. It's just really sweet. Okay, Caleb. Most churches have a story that, if known, would be interesting. Excuse me. Thank you. Brought the wrong stuff. Thank you. What you've done is a remarkable achievement. I want to say, as a church historian, you've done a really good job writing this. It's extremely well written. It's incredibly well researched. It's a story worth telling. But that really doesn't work unless it's well told. And so I want to thank you for that. It really is a great example, and I frankly hope that a lot of other churches, Capitol's got unique resources, just given the brain power there. But what was your biggest surprise writing this, and what was the biggest challenge?
The sheer volume of material was a massive challenge to begin to wade through, and it wasn't organized, so I had to develop an archival system for it, box folder.
You said 30,000 pages?
Yeah, that's well. We digitized about half of it, the most important, because these boxes were all under the baptistry in the basement of the church, and I thought,
what could go wrong?
So we digitized the most important. So that was 50,000 pages to digitize, but I think the sheer volume was overwhelming, and knowing what to keep. There were so many surprises. Some of the happiest surprises were discovering 2 folders of Carl F. H. Henry documents in the basement that were previously unknown, Sunday school notes and then correspondence. Wow. And the correspondence led to some really significant discoveries. One detail was that Carl Henry writes to the pastor shortly after MLK's letter from the Birmingham jail saying, Bill Colbreth, who's a Birmingham native, it took great courage for you to come out so strongly in favor of integration as you did today. So we got, that's a significant moment in evangelical history and Carl F. H. Henry. So
you had Senator Mark Hatfield, one of the very powerful members of the United States Senate, who was there.
Yeah. Those kinds of discoveries were just wonderful, delightful surprises, and hopefully a larger contribution. You mentioned writing a narrative. I did want to write a good narrative. I do not like dry books, and I wanted it to have the feel of narrative history. And one way I did that was by teaching it to our church first. I taught it as a Sunday school class for 13 weeks, and one thing that came from that is everyone in the class said what we liked most about it were the lessons. don't just describe what happened. Analyze it, tell us what it means, and apply it to the present day. And I thought at first, I can't do that. The historian's job isn't to explain or apply, it's just to describe. And I realized, no, as a Christian historian, we're not just describing the past, we are interpreting and applying it. And so that I hope that comes through in the book. At the end of each chapter, there are lessons from the history.